I make about 8,000 a month from my podcast, but I don't sell anything on my podcast. I've got no sponsorship. I've got no brand deals, no nothing. I am just selling me. But I want to share with you in this episode about how that all came about, because I didn't choose to start a podcast. I've been doing it now for like 2 or 3 years. But what it turned out to be is a big moneymaker. And I actually owe the credit to this to a guy called Simon. Back in 2022-23, I hired a freelancer to help me look at funnels, ads, and things outside of LinkedIn. And Simon did some work with us for about 6 months. Weirdly, no big deal, but we didn't continue the relationship because some of the things we were trying to do just didn't work out as we thought. And one of the things that he did, and he recommended we do, is convert the hours and hours of video content that I've put together into podcast episodes and launch a podcast. And so in 2022, December 2022, I think it was, Simon took a load of my video content, turned it into audios, and started the podcast. And then I carried that podcast on. And over the last 3 years, 4 years or so, 3.5 years nearly now, I've just kept doing it. And kept doing it. And more and more people have started to say, Dean, I found you from your podcast. Now, I've been doing this podcast like clockwork and never really tracked the numbers. I tracked obviously the downloads and the streams, and they've been a roller coaster of up and down. But what I found was that the podcast was a great long-term asset. When I started it, it was like 10 downloads, 13 downloads, all that kind of stuff. And I didn't want to promote it on LinkedIn too much because the whole issue of external links. But over 3 and a bit years of doing it, it's made me a lot of money, even though it's not, it's charted once, and that's more recently. But for 2 or 3 years, it didn't do, by podcast standards very well. But it made me a lot of money. And so I wanted to share with you some of the things that I've been doing in that podcast, because some of my podcasts have not even had guests. I've just been me talking like this, but a flip in the way you think about podcasting so you can make money from it, even if you don't chart, even if you don't go nuts. Now, one of the great things about podcasting is you can record it once and it can go to Apple, it can go to Amazon, it can go to all these different places that people can find it. And you only have to record it and push it out in one place. All the podcasting platforms connect with the big places where people consume podcasts. So you do it once in one place and it goes all over everywhere. But a lot of people see the podcast as the revenue stream. So, you get sponsorships, you get all of those things, and that's how the podcasts make money. My podcast is a relationship machine. It's not a revenue stream, the podcast itself. It's a chance for people to get to know me, to get invested in the way I think, the way I work, the way I talk. Because if people want to buy into what I do and my mission to help people sell easier and better, they need to buy into me. And this is the same for you. So if you're thinking about doing a podcast, it's a great creative outlet for you to distill your thoughts, but it's also a chance for people to connect with you. That's how brands are built, and that's how trust is built. And sadly, many people who start podcasts, and I saw this, right? If you go onto any of the podcasting and start to search any of the platforms that serve podcasts, you'll find there is a graveyard of podcasts of people who gave up. And the reason why they gave up is because they did not see instant returns. And in the podcasting world, you have to think about it differently. It is a long-term asset you're building. It's not something 5 episodes you can go, wow, this is transforming my life. It is a system to build long-term results. Last week, somebody signed up for my one-to-one program. They invested dollars to work one-to-one with me because they've been listening to my podcast and I talk a lot of sense. That's the power of the podcast. You don't need a huge audience. In fact, I'd encourage you to make a super niche one because you'll get a better quality of listener. But the revenue is a lagging indicator of the trust you're building through the podcast. So it doesn't need to be a big audience. If it's the right 10 or the right 100 people paying attention to you, that's really straightforward to do. Anybody can do it, even down to the kit you need. I'm recording this with a device, a little kit I bought called Hollywood. It's called a Hollywood kit. It plugs into my phone and I can do it anywhere on the go. And it cost me maybe £100. It's pretty good quality. I use an online editing software that's designed for dummies, Riverside, so I don't even have to tinker with it. I can just click a button and the AI improves the audio and I can be out. So you don't need a big audience. You don't need a lot of tech, but it is a long-term game. It's a long-term game of being very focused on topic, but actually helping people see your thinking, telling your stories, your experiences. And I'm so glad Simon suggested this. And maybe my mistake back then was when I engaged with Simon was putting short-term over long-term. If I'd have known now how good this podcast would have done for me, I probably would have appreciated it and maybe kept him on a little longer if I'd have kept doing it, if I'd have realized the value that this could have to me. So, if you're thinking about, should I start a podcast? You absolutely should. It's good for you in terms of distilling your thinking. It's good for building that brand and trust outside of social media bubbles. You don't need a huge audience to make money from it as long as your topic is really tight. So I would start a podcast if I were you, but I wouldn't put pressure on yourself to, one, do it weekly like I do, because I find this very difficult sometimes, particularly when I'm traveling. Two, I wouldn't put pressure on yourself to grow it as like a main thing. I would have it working away in the background. Three, I'd think about how you repurpose podcasts. So could this become clips? So maybe once you get going, you could record the video at the same time and then convert it into clips. Could you take the transcripts and turn it into blogs? So it's a great multi-purposer. And if you struggle writing content, struggle writing articles, actually, this is where AI can come into play because I can record what I want to say, share it with the world through the podcast, and then go, right, AI, keep my thoughts, don't change my words, but turn it into a blog that makes sense. Break it up into 5 posts. It's a real simple way to do it. And I'd never appreciated how powerful this could be in terms of generating leads and business for me, that people would find the podcast, say on Spotify, find the podcast on Amazon or Apple, and then go, I like the sound of this guy. I like he's making sense. But the niche ones, the niche podcasts are really where you want to go. I made the mistake of jumping around a little bit because I was trying to figure out what I'm doing with this. But if you could go in on one particular thing so that you get a really tight audience, you'll make money with it faster. It might not blow up and become, world leading, top 10 podcasts in the world. But if you've got the right flow of people paying attention to it, the conversion is going to be insane. If I'm doing a generalized podcast, something like Joe Rogan, where every episode is to a completely different topic. 1 minute they're talking about the mysteries of the pyramids, and next it's about politics, and next it's about... If you do that kind of route, yes, Joe Rogan's built his brand with it because it's massive. But getting sales from it becomes like, what can I sell that everybody can buy? Whereas if you go very niche, you don't need as big an audience, which is, for most people, a good thing. The whole concept of going, oh my God, I've got another thing to maintain is difficult. But if you go, well, hang on a minute, I'm just going to go really niche. So the topic will get found easier. The podcast will get found easier by the right audience. I'm just going to share my thoughts and let this be a way people can get to know me and get to know how I think and some of my ideas. you're going to do really well. Now, one of the things I've learned about this with guests, oh my God, guests are the most difficult thing on earth, right? You can get a stream of guests for your podcast really easy, but getting guests that actually are worth having on is really hard. So I've had a couple of times where I've had guests on, and what I think makes a podcast really interesting is when you're telling actual stories. And I'll say, so what's the biggest challenge you've had in business? What's the worst case scenario you've had? Oh, I think the hardest thing I've had is consistency. I was like, oh, please, let's not go there. Getting guests who'll actually tell you the stories behind their struggles, the details, is really hard. Some people have got really good stories to share. And then when you get them on the podcast, they just don't go there. And you're like, so tell us the story behind it. And they just give you a summary. So even when you go in advance to the guest and say, look, you've got to share stories, specific details, because that's what people want to hear, they come out with these like generic statements like, oh yeah, I think the biggest challenge for a business owner these days is, consistency. And I'm like, really? Could we get into the meat or the weeds of that a bit more? So that's a big struggle I have when I have guests. So often that's why I don't have guests, because I sometimes go, I feel bad not putting the episode out, but I also don't want to put it out because I know it's crap. So those details, the specific, the stakes really matter. I didn't make a plan that I was going to make money from my podcast. I just did it. And I just did it over and over and over and over and over again. I've got 10 talking points for this podcast in front of me, and I'm just talking about my experiences with them. It's so weird how this whole mechanism of podcasting, even though it's not the best production, even though I'm doing this from a hotel room in Oklahoma, people are buying into me because it's real. And I think that is what makes a podcast really good. The realness of it. I've been on some podcasts where it's so super scripted and I have to they tell me in advance what they're going to ask me. They say, we don't want to talk about this. We do want to talk about this. I find that just being me, sharing my ideas is what works. And like I said, the editing bit, sure, Riverside, I'll edit some bits and pieces out, but you're getting the raw, unfiltered me. For you to get a customer, for me to get a customer, to get a client, they're going to have to see lots of bits and pieces of us. The podcast, the posts, the blogs, the website, the PR, the email list, all of that stuff is working for you. The problem is that a lot of what we do as marketing, it's hard to know it is working. If somebody tells me they just bought from the podcast, then I know. But very often, it's a series of things that are happening for your customers. It might be that one post triggers them to DM you. It might be that email pushes them to buy or book a call. But what were the other things that got them to that point? And the podcast for me is one of those things. But over time, I've seen how this podcast has actually brought people and been the tipping point for people to buy. It's not the only thing, but it is the tipping point. And likewise, my email list, my Substack, my YouTube, tipping points, all of those things are working together. And we'd love to say, and maybe this is a reflection of my journey with Simon, and I'm going to message him after this and tell him I've mentioned him in the podcast. Maybe the tipping point for you, and this is the challenge with the graveyard of dead podcasts, is that people have give up too soon and not realized how the podcast is part of their tipping point. So they put everything on it and short-term success on it and not realize how it all fits together. Coming to the point with Simon, the reason why I ended the engagement with Simon is because we couldn't see at that point how anything was progressing. That was a mistake. Because actually, The podcast was a big move. But also what we'd engaged Simon to do was help us build a funnel. And the funnel itself was, a classic kind of ClickFunnels style thing. And the journey that people were making, we couldn't get it to work as well as we'd wanted to. And it was at that point I had the realization, and this is relevant for the podcast discussion now. People don't buy in neat, tidy funnels, not the kind of high value stuff anyway. It's amazing how many people I've seen who go, yeah, we'll build this neat, tidy funnel. Where they go from here, they go from here, they go from here, they go from here. And that works if it's like small amounts. That works if it's like, oh, it's $30 and no, I'll go to $200. But generally, that doesn't work if you're trying to sell something at $10,000. People need multiple exposures. And so podcasting can make you money by being one of those things. It's great as well because it sits outside of social media. A lot of people in my world, in my industry, they contain themselves to social media. And there's a big wide world beyond social media. There's in-person, there's expos, there's podcasts, there's YouTube videos, there's everything you can do. And I'd love to say, oh, you only need to do one thing. Doing one thing on LinkedIn is a good move. But actually building that ecosystem of trust outside of that little social bubble is so important. One, because what happens if LinkedIn decides to change the game? You're done. What happens if that social channel no longer works for you? But importantly, if you're selling something high value, people are going to go, who is this person? And there's a lot of gurus you look at and you can't find anything about their business. Nothing. You can't find any kind of proper website, no office address. None of those things that help you build confidence exist. There's a guru I'm on Facebook with, and I actually bought his course a number of years ago. And he claims to have made millions doing what he does. But if you go to Google, the only thing you'll find of him is basically his socials. When he says he's made 50 million doing what he does, you can't find any evidence of that. You can't find any records. So given that we're living in that post-truth era, we got AI, we got politicians saying whatever they want. There's no authority on truth anymore. It's important to have stuff out there for people to find. Stuff out there to help people build trust. And I never expected this podcast to make money the way it does. I never expected that. I kind of hoped it would take off and, maybe I could sell sponsorships or something like that. That's what I really wanted. But actually what's happened is, even though it's grown and I get good views and good downloads, the amount of business I'm getting, I could probably, if I wanted to, I'm not going to do this, but if I wanted to, I could cut off everything else I do and literally just go all in on the podcast. And if I was a solopreneur, I'm not, but if I was, I could make a good living just off this podcast. I could just do it. Why? Because people are buying into me. It's like a talk show, isn't it? It's like a radio show. Yeah. Podcasting is like radio. And people made a good living from doing a radio show. So what should you do? If you're thinking about doing a podcast, what should you do? Don't go crazy on kit to begin with. You could just literally record it on your computer or on your phone. You need a simple editing tool. So Riverside is pretty good for that. So you could record it on your phone on their app. Record it, just talk it out, share it. There's an editing tool built into Riverside where you can just click and get rid of your ums and ahs and click and improve the audio quality with AI. Then you can export it and then you've got to get it distributed. Simple way to distribute a podcast. I use Podbean. Podbean, you can upload the audio file, upload a description. It's really simple. Give it a title and then you can publish and it goes straight onto Podbean's platform. But you can also couple it up to Apple really easily, couple it up to Spotify really easily, couple it up to Amazon really easy, and a host of other things and push it out. You could do once a month. You could do bi-weekly. You can choose how often you do it, But think about the podcast as, I don't really need a big audience. I just need a small audience to buy into me. So a niche podcast would work the best. If you run an MSP, you could talk about, do a podcast about tech efficiency for CEOs. If you were trying to attract coaching clients, you could talk about a topic, a power of your mind. It doesn't have to be, or you could niche onto an audience. CIO, you could focus on a CIO and do a podcast for a CIO. Think about what your audience is interested in, and a real narrow audience would be the best option. You'll get lower views, but you will actually get more quality views of people who potentially could buy from you. So you don't need a lot of tech. You don't need a big audience. You need your ideas, your opinions, what I call APE, A-P-E. You need an angle, you need a perspective or opinions, and you need experience. That's all you need to share in your content. Angles, perspectives, and experiences. And my experience of doing the podcast, I've found it incredibly rewarding. I've enjoyed doing it. And all I do is share my thoughts, things that have been on my mind this week. I share those. I think about what the struggles are for the people listening to me and how can I help them. And then I put my own experiences into it. So this podcast is making me $8,000 a month. I never planned it. I just did it, just shared my opinions. And it's not the biggest podcast in the world. I've had some huge heavy hit. One got 25,000 downloads, which is incredible. Most of them are between 500 and 2,500, but the first one, it was like 13. It was horrific. So think about, could you start a podcast? Could you share your ideas? Because I think if you want to get your message out there and build a long-term marketing asset, a podcast is a brilliant move for you. It's worked for me. I didn't take it seriously at first. And then I realized this is a massive trust and relationship building machine. Even today, I've had a download of my first episode that was 3.5 years ago. So it's working forever. For as long as you keep doing it, it'll keep working away, building that trust and building those relationships.